everyone. I'm excited to be here. I really can't wait to hear Steve, so I'm going to talk really fast because I haven't met him before. The first time I gave a version of what I'm going to give to you today, I was working with Ma. So I try to integrate everything I learned from her presentation into what I'm doing today, and tonight I'll go home and integrate everything I learned from Steve into yet another version. So, the term breadline, for me, is both a symbol and product of the Great Depression. That's how I learned about it. The breadline came up in a lot of Great Depression histories that I was reading because it was this kind of marker of the rapid deterioration of class lines. The example that came up most often is, a banker could be standing next to a drugstore clerk, and you couldn't tell who was who. Because they were both on the breadline. They were both formerly unemployed. So I really loved that idea of the breadline as a way to understand a lack of class boundaries that the crash created. So my interest then was in this kind of social and cultural change. And I understood that through individual lives. The first of whom, for me, was Dorothy Lange. I think her story still is fascinating. She was a successful portrait photographer when the Great Depression hit, living in San Francisco. The world below her studio, as she looked out one day, looked all shocked and panicky. That's a quote. Portraits soon became records, documents. So those records sought to articulate this preponderance of poverty that she saw suddenly marking a world that she used to know. Through those documents, she met Paul Taylor. Taylor was a productive scholar in the 1920s. He had been working for labor and agriculture in a number of places for years. And so Lange herself was unused to photographing field workers and migrants. She learned a lot from him in order to do that. Her turn from studio to street to field was rapid and quite profound. Breadlines became a local and localized response, intersecting with both the national reality of unmet want as well as a marker of dignity and individuality. And she began to see those in the field as well, despite the horrible conditions she saw. Working together, Taylor and Lange concentrated on the regional, national intercourse that they began working on in migrant housing in the Central Valley. Paul was just crazy for migrant housing. He dedicated so much time and energy to it, and that was their initial foray into text and photographs. They created government reports, and Taylor insisted on using Lange's photographs in these government reports. Nothing had ever happened like that before. So traveling up and down California to create those reports, they literally revolutionized reportage. Taylor's statistics worked in tandem with Lange's photographs. In their work, they set out to construct a written and visual narrative that cohered the fragmented lives of displaced farm workers into a recognizable idea and image that they themselves felt that could plead the economic case of the impoverished as well as elevate them, give them the dignity they saw. So people living in rags, living in shanties, living in cars, that was for them not a critique of those people, but an admission of California's guilt in not respecting those on whose work it relied. So the culminating project that they did began in an essay Taylor published in Survey Graphic called Again the Covered Wagon. That too used Lange's photographs. Taylor began the essay, vast clouds of dust rise and roll across the Great Plains. He invokes the visual and compares the dispersion of soil to the waste of human life. After the drifting dust clouds drift the people. Over the concrete ribbons of highways which lead out in every direction come the refugees, we are witnessing the process of social erosion and a consequent shifting of human sands in a government which is increasing and may become great. So in 1939, their book appeared titled An American Exodus, A Record of Human Erosion. Taylor and Lange drew the title from themes in the earlier essay. They built their book on what they said was a tripod of photographs, captions, and text, illustrating themes which evolved out of long observation in the field. So they wanted clearly to create a new way to convey what they regarded not as a narrative, but as their findings. Taylor was a social scientist, and so what he felt he was doing was literally collecting evidence, and that's what he felt Lange was doing with her photographs. Taylor and Lange stated, "In this book, we adhere to the standards of documentary photography as we have conceived them. Quotations which accompany photographs report what the person's photograph said, not what they think might be their unspoken thoughts." Transparency then, this was an important goal. They wanted to be transparent. They wanted to acknowledge that what they were doing came from other people, not themselves. Both believed that the impact of the Great Depression could only be felt by allowing people to tell their own stories. So they said, "Our work has produced the book, but in the situations which we describe are living participants who can speak," they wrote in the book. "So far as possible, we have let them speak to you face to face." So in attempting to hand over authorship, they really acknowledged the frailty and strength of their position. In that final statement, they both justify their work and expose the weakness of it. In the process of documentation and reporting, those who are under the microscope actually have an altered identity, one that results from the very process of being documented. The result then is not simply recording, but a narrative, both a real and an imagined response to the 30s and the many social, economic, and cultural shifts they brought. So the narrative is apparent in the fact that Taylor and Lange tell the same story, but they tell it in different ways. Taylor's work differs from Lange's because he is really kind of fixated on the forgotten man from FDR's text, that 1/3 of a nation that is abandoned. He felt that the country had abandoned them. He believed in conserving past values, but he believed in conserving them for the sake of those who had not traditionally enjoyed them. Despite California's ability to prove him wrong, he had faith in small farms and land ownership and water, and the firm belief in the contemporary economic principles, including the mass redistribution of farmland and labor. So what you get then is a Taylor who seems determined to resurrect or even reconstruct the Western mythos of the hardy pioneer, referring again and again to Dust Bowl migrants as pioneers. Lange's take was quite different. Many of her photographs, particularly those of women, suggest a collision of ideology, reality, and expectations that women faced in California, particularly in the Central Valley. Much of Lange's work, much of Lange's work focuses on the story of how the Great Depression both continued the social destabilization of women's role in society and at the same time introduced new and unique complications of that role. Questions of worth, value, and place become very, very difficult to pin down. Remember, at this point in time, suffragism's focus on voting might have even obscured the larger and more abstract reality of subjectivity, who a woman is. Lange took on that question, and in the Central Valley's field workers, she saw their perfect representation, photographing migrant women whose domestic lives were lived in a public space, or a spectacle, of roadside, ditch bank, and even government camps. Lange documented maternal anguish, marital strife, and a lack of clear female identity. Her work could juxtapose all the markers of domestic tidiness and care and order, pans hanging on the walls, pots on stoves, brooms sweeping dirt, with the fact that the walls are made of bamboo, the stoves are constructed of cardboard boxes, and the brooms are sweeping dirt. As Depression-era women turned to housekeeping to create stability, Lange's photographed subject kept housed in cars, by freeways, moving again and again, living the mobile life of a migrant farmer. So, for her, it really seemed as if the West had failed for Dust Bowl migrants. And it interrogates the whole reality of the dream of the West. But as poets have written, dreams are deferred, they don't die. Built on strategies of survival, learning to value ideological modes of translation, immigrants and migrants learn that dream is a traveling concept, one that can begin in the past and integrate the present to make a dream of the future. That ideology is dominant in the work of Oklahoma migrant, field worker, and Central Valley transplant, Wilma McDaniel. So what you get then is, from Wilma, a real re-evaluation, not simply of, Oklahoma, which is where she came from, but this kind of juxtaposition, this collision of what she grew up thinking a woman should be and the reality of what California would let her be. You couldn't keep house, literally. You grew up thinking that you were supposed to be a housekeeper, and your house is always moving. So that factors into my read of what Wilma offers us. She offers us many things, but because of what she's looking at specifically, I turn to this photograph of Lange's. You've got this woman standing outside of her tent, and Lange, by this point in time, would walk up and say, "I'm going to take your photograph. Are you okay with that?" And this woman says, "Are you going to take my photograph? Wait till I comb my hair." As I've pointed out in talks before, clearly a hair comb is not going to help her. I mean, she's dirty. She lives in dirt. Her hair is dirty. This is not the moment to call in for the makeup crew. And yet she's articulating something very, very important about what is expected of women, particularly in California. So, one thing that happens is this ideology of the movie star, and that is so strong in California. So the experience of rural women in the 30s was a sort of vernacular, existing in geographically isolated areas, locked in regionally specific practices, but literally the Hollywood movie star travels across, in and out. It was as isolated and regionally specific as possible in the Central Valley. For migrant women living impoverished lives only miles from the Hollywood screen stars whose dress and appearance they longed to emulate, the visual mark movie stars made offered an individual translation as well as communal subjectivity. They all believe they are Mary Pickfords. And that is literally like a trans something belief. If I put my makeup on, if I comb my hair, I too can be Mary Pickford. So you get then Hollywood's lure offering a means of unification to rural women whose lives of chronic migration prevent any sense of community, any sense of friendship. In California camps, the beauty culture provides a common bond. So I turn then to some of my favorite poems by Wilma. This one, I really love this idea. Wilma McDaniel felt something strong for Jean Harlow. It wasn't just that she wanted to comb her hair, she wanted to be Jean Harlow, and she felt an affinity. This one is my probably favorite. This one is called Hoeing Cotton in High Heels, and it follows a little boy named Cyrus living in Big Muddy, And he goes to the show and he sees all these beautiful dancers. And he's literally just, he goes outside, he sees his mom, she's got a grocery bag, she's wearing cotton socks. That's how women in Big Muddy look like. And he thinks to himself, how in the world can they hold cotton in high heels? So I love that because it's such a great example of the translation of cultures. So, for me, the art of the Central Valley relies on various sources. Those who, in adopting the legal role of a guardian, assume to speak for Central Valleyans, like Lange and Taylor's, and those who, born, raised, or transplanted to the Central Valley, speak to experiences individually perceived and communally experienced.